For the believer, what counts above all is that the shroud is a mirror of the gospel. These are not here because of imagination. These correspond to the historical account of the passion of our Lord in the Gospels. They also correspond to the scientific study of the shroud. So we welcome you to Who is the Man of the Shroud? This is our museum related to the studies of the Shroud of Turin, and we have two major parts in the museum, a historical study and a natural science study. And at the end, a couple of culminating images that are worthwhile to hang in there and wait for. And the shroud itself is represented here in this miniature. It's 14 feet long and about almost 4 feet wide, and that'll be 4.5 meters by over 1 meter wide. And the shroud is a very special piece of cloth. For the first fact that it exists, that it's very old. There was actually a shroud, a burial shroud, found near here in the valley of Gehenna, right at the intersection where it hits into the Kedron Valley, across from Mount Zion. And it's actually the area called Hakeldama, the field of blood, bought with the money, according to tradition, that Judas got for handing over Jesus. And there's a monastery there run by Romanian sisters within the Orthodox Christianity family, and there are scores of tombs. And on opening one of these tombs, which was completely sealed for 2,000 years, they found a skeleton wrapped in a cloth. And that obviously became very interesting. And some of the fascinating aspects of that discovery were that they proved that the man died from two diseases, from tuberculosis and leprosy, like we have today. When they opened up the tomb, it had been very dry and sealed completely from air, so the entire cloth was intact. But once they opened it up and started to interfere with the cloth, it disintegrated immediately into dust. But here we have a cloth that hasn't been sealed up dry for whoever knows how long. Instead, it has been exposed over and over again in all kinds of circumstances. It has survived at least 3 major fires, and it's still intact in the greatest extent. It has suffered quite some damage. So in that sense, it's a fascinating historical old piece of cloth. You can see these triangular holes in the cloth, and they are from a fire in Chambéry in France. And they said before, they used to say that a piece of molten silver fell down through the cloth when it was folded and made all of these holes. Now they're not sure exactly what was the original cause of this, but it did happen at that fire. So if you were to fold the cloth along this fringe, you would superimpose these two holes. And you could do the same with the fringe on the top that's along this burn line. And then we just have to do one other one, and you'd have all the holes superimposed. And then if you fold it down the middle, and then once more, you get all of these holes superimposed. Then you have another set of holes here called poker holes. And there are really 4 big ones, but there are quite a few smaller ones. And they're copied here, and then they're copied over here. So we only have 2 sets, if you will, or 2 folds to explain that. So the cloth was folded in a different way at that point. Another piece of the cloth that's interesting is this square or oblong that's missing here. And this was taken out for the carbon-14 dating test 23 years ago. And that's a major venue of reflection about the shroud, or reference to the shroud, in the media for the last 23 years. And with this carbon-14 dating test, what was given as proven fact was that the linen plants, the linen cloth, which is made from flax plants, came from flax plants that grew on this planet between the years 1260 and 1390. Now, in very good American English, fat chance it was in the tomb. It was 1400 years too young to be in the tomb of Jesus. And that's the soundbite that continually is delivered in all media reports, basically, or 99% of media reports about the Shroud, the regular, general, secular media. Now, they ignore a constant, increasing scientific criticism of this test. And finally, BBC, on Holy Saturday 3 years ago, broadcast a documentary with scientists from the original 3 tests in Freiburg in Switzerland, Oxford, and Tucson, showing that the test had failed and that it had not given an accurate result. And the main reason was that you have strands of cotton which were introduced here that were not even linen. And that was not discerned in the original test procedures, unfortunately, which raises some questions also about the test. And it also was in contravening the original agreement not to use the fringes because they had been heavily handled over the centuries with sweat and dust accumulating and bacterial accumulation, which would alter the carbon-14 content. So they discovered that this piece of cloth was rewoven according to a style of weave called French weave, which basically is a very sophisticated weave that us normal lay people in weaving would not recognize anything if we looked at it. Experts examining would say, wow, something happened here, and then they could go in and find out what was introduced. So this cotton was introduced by Margaret of Savoy, who at that point was already married as Margaret of Habsburg, shortly after Charles V. And she obviously had access to the cloth because it was owned by the Savoy family. So then she had taken a portion of the shroud, some threads, to constitute a relic for her church, and then had that replaced so to cover up her little operation. Now obviously if you introduce textile to the cloth that's younger than 500 years, it's going to skew the results of a carbon-14 dating test on a cloth that some people claimed was 2,000 years old. You understand the dynamic here? But nowadays, it's absolutely serenely accepted by the scientific community that that test is no longer a reference point for understanding the Shroud. It's basically a footnote in the history of its research. And if you want, I can send you a file that thick of computer documents about these studies. So there's plenty of information to investigate. Now, the most important and fascinating feature of the Shroud is the presence of the image of a man. There's an image of a man on the Shroud. Can you see the image? So here you have the face of the man, his chest, his arms, you can even see the fingers on the miniature, and his legs. And then, do you see anything else of the man? You can see the back of the man. Here you have a water stain, which is nothing other than that. Here is his head, his neck, his shoulders, his buttocks, and his legs, down as far as his bloodied soles of his feet, included in the image. Here we have a very unique reality already. We have an image of a man, front and back. Check out your pictures in your cameras. How many take the front and the back at the same time? Look at even these works of art. Here we have Michelangelo's Pietà, and we only see the front. Here we have this Christ image from Chicago area, Warner Salmon from 1940s, and we only see one profile. We don't see front and back, right? So here we have a very unique image. It's just another very interesting feature. How many images of importance do we have that have front and back? That's also unique. It's intriguing. Now, anatomically speaking, the reproductions of the Shroud of Turin that were made painting-wise on paper to have a souvenir before the era of photography, and there are quite a few, even done with great accomplished skillful people, have not been able to reproduce the anatomy, the human anatomy properly. And the femur might be longer on one side than the other. And there might be some major anatomical issues, mistakes. And the fascinating thing about the Shroud image is that the anatomy of the front and also of the back are both in very, very top level of accomplishment. And on top of that, both of them match. So they're both from the same person. So here we could even say, if we just had this about the shroud, we have a great work of anatomical rendering. Okay? Another feature of this man is that he is dressed with all the wounds that we would associate directly with the Passion account of the Gospel. So we have a lot of scourging wounds, especially on the back, but not exclusive to the back. His head has a crown of thorns that's not a band above the ears, but a complete head cover. Now there's a fascinating little piece of problem with that the fact that we have this crown that covers the whole head raises a big question. Because in medieval Europe, nobody knew that kings here in the Middle East were crowned with a complete head cover in antiquity. So if the shroud should be medieval, how come they got the crown correct? An interesting challenge. He has a broken nose cartilage, a pierced side wound, on which, through spectroscopic analysis, they found post-mortem blood. And that does match the account of the Gospel. Interesting. And who knew about that back when? You see, there's a big fight between if the shroud is medieval or is from Jesus' tomb. Now, I don't get into that. And I don't want to try to influence you. You make up your own mind in our museum. In fact, to make it easier for you, I say that Leonardo did the shroud. Leonardo da Vinci. Okay? And he was very smart, so he accomplished a lot of good things. If you're angry with me about this, that's okay. And I'll even help you to argue against me. You see, his wrists are pierced, and as his feet, in classical Roman-style crucifixion. So now we have the complete gamut of wounds, the major characteristic wounds of the Passion of Jesus, as related by the Gospels. So what could you say from that? Well, we can say that here we have a Christ-like image. That's not proving anything. That's just saying that the content of our image is Christ-like. That's when you look at this and you say, who's this talking about? It's Calvary, Friday evening. And you look at this image and that's a Christ-like image. There are certain features and characteristics that tell us that an image is Christ-like, but that doesn't prove that this was on Calvary. It's a piece of Italian marble that never made it to Calvary. So you understand the point I'm making? That this is a Christ-like image doesn't make any claim regarding the date of the cloth. So everybody can be at peace and agree with that. Now, the image has many different features that are very interesting, natural physical features. We dealt with the anatomy. It has another feature called directionality. Directionality. From here to you, in this direction, in that direction. So when a work is analyzed, let's say a painting, it's possible for the scholars to come and study where the paint strokes went. That works if you have an original that's not a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, right? And they can retrace all of the strokes that an artist gave to the object and establish the direction of the strokes. That's directionality. Now they can also say, did he do it from this angle or did he do it from that angle? Directionality. They can also establish where his eye and his pen had contact. It was like this, it was like this. Directionality. Now I have a question for you. How much directionality is there in the image of the shroud? Any takers? None. Zero. Absolutely zero. And all of these very realistic features, also the gravity. The law of gravity is extraordinarily followed in detail. And you never find this in a work of art. If there is one, tell me about it, please. But this would be very unusual, because an artist isn't thinking about doing the law of gravity in detail. He just wants to give you a powerful impression, right? So here you have all these very realistic things with the anatomy, the directionality, the law of gravity, the light, many different features. And there is now a standing consensus among the scholars of the Shroud that the image we have in Turin could not have been produced freehand by an artist. That image had to be produced in the presence and with direct relationship to a real body, marked by all the wounds that we find on the image of Turin. You follow me? How are we doing?
Very good.
Okay. So now, a few other little headlines that we'll do then later in detail. The image was discovered to have the qualities of something approaching a photographic negative. It behaves like a photographic negative. And it also has 3D depth. So it has 3D depth information of the body in whose relation it was developed. So the first word I'd like to point out here is presumed route of the shroud. Okay? This is a presumed route of the shroud. And what is not presumed is the information in Europe. This is absolutely certain, geographically and historically. So we are certain that the shroud is in Lirey by 1354, which might prompt some of you to suggest opposing my theory that it was done by Leonardo, because you might have calculated that it's in Lirey a century before he's born. But that's actually not a problem for me, because I know he was very intelligent and he might have had a time warp machine. This is actually one of the proofs that he had a time warp machine. And it's also interesting that there are documentaries produced by two television companies from another part of the Commonwealth, from Australia. And the Episcopalian pilgrims here 3 years ago told me about them. They had seen both of them that previous year. And they both concluded that Leonardo da Vinci had done it. Good. Now I have a question for you. Why is Jerusalem on the map of the Shroud? The scholars of the Shroud tell us that besides the image on the Shroud, we have other images, including 2 coins, and we'll do a study on those upstairs, flower images, and we'll do a big study on those upstairs. It's fascinating. And then there are other objects that we can go into later. So if you have things that are exclusively from Jerusalem on or connected to the Shroud, there you have a rational motivation to say there is a Jerusalem connection. Next question, why is Edessa on the map of the Shroud? And Edessa was a major city in Armenia, maybe even the capital for a while. Armenia was the first country. Now you know there is a place called Armenia. We even have an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, in the old city. Armenia was the first country to declare Christianity their national religion in the year 301. So even before the Roman Empire turned Christian. So they had a cloth, which is a historical fact without debate and discussion. It's a certainty that they had a cloth called the Mandellian. And it was called the Mandellian because they understood that it had the image of the face of Jesus. And that's why it was very precious for them. It was considered to be the most precious possession that the Christians had from Jesus, because it was his face. Now we can't prove that that image was of his face, but that's the story that they told about that cloth. Okay? And at some point, this story has a lot of history to it, and a lot of legend and a lot of history. This cloth, this town of Edessa is conquered by the Muslims in the 7th century, and obviously some Muslim leaders are more open than others, and at some point the Emperor of Constantinople had enough, and he said, we want this cloth in Constantinople so we can always have the access that we need to it. And he actually gave 200 Muslim prisoners and a lot of money to get the cloth to Constantinople on the 14th of August, 944, before your grandmother was born. And that cloth came to Constantinople, and a very interesting fact happens that they changed the name from Mandellian to Sindone. Now it turns out that in the Greek gospel, the word that's used for the cloth that Joseph of Arimathea gets to bury Jesus is Sindone. So we could ask a legitimate question: how come they changed the name from Mandellian to Sindone? Why did they do that? We leave that standing. And it's in Constantinople for 260 years exactly, until a very, very sad date, 1204. What happened in 1204? Fourth Crusade, coming from Christian Europe, to take back the tomb from the Muslims. And because they had too much Irish whiskey on the boat, they go in and attack Constantinople and plunder every single church in the city. And they steal and rob. And that's still remembered in Orthodox Christianity with great bitterness. And it caused so much damage to our relationship, East and West Christianity. So we know for a fact that at that time the Sindone disappears. And we know some things about the Sindone up to that time in Constantinople, that they used to venerate it every Friday. Now, why would they venerate it on Friday necessarily if it's the face of Jesus? Are there some clues that suggest why it should be venerated on Friday? We can leave that standing also. Now, we know for a fact that the Emperor of Constantinople, that his grandson, writes a letter to the Pope demanding the immediate return of the Sindone in the context of the Fourth Crusade. So that means there's, first of all, the understanding that it's disappeared, and secondly, there's an accusation that the Crusaders have taken it to the West. And what can a poor Pope do with the crusade out of control? In fact, apparently he even excommunicated this crusade twice. I still have to have that in writing, but I understand that's what happened. Now, another fact we know with certainty is that one of the key leaders of the crusade, his name was Otto de Roche, a French fellow. And he also became Latin Duke of Athens for a short period. But we know that he had a great-great-granddaughter. Who is here who has in their family the closest thing to a great-great-grandchild? Margie, you have a great-grandchild, a great-great-grandchild.
Great.
How old is your grandchild, your great-grandchild?
Both of them are less than a year.
Both are less than a year. And does anybody have awareness of another grandchild relationship, great-grandchild relationship that's a little older?
Great-grandchild.
How old?
4 and
4 and 3. So another 15 years, and there could be a great-great-grandmother relationship there. You know? So you don't have to think about that today. But so it's possible, you see. And this guy's great-great-granddaughter, Jeanne de Vergès, gets married in Lirey. And guess what her dowry was?
Shroud.
The Shroud of Turin. Now, what we don't know is where she got it, but we do know that her great-great-grandfather sacked Constantinople. Was the Sindone that disappeared the Shroud of Turin that his great-great-granddaughter has as her dowry? You know how much the dowry was worth? Her own granddaughter sold it for 2 castles to the Dukes of Savoy, the kings of Italy. And don't forget that castles in the day had their heliport and their golf courses. Well, at least they had huge hunting tracts of land for foxes and deer and all the rest of it. So the Savoy family moved to Chambéry, and this is where the triangular holes get burned that we were looking at a few minutes ago. And then they transferred to Turin, which was the capital of Savoy, Italy at that time. Okay? And it's still there to this day, and it's called the Shroud of Turin. So here we have an image of the Mandellian from Edessa, and it's represented in the part of the story of how they explained its origins. I ask the pilgrims always here to give me some reasons why it's evident from this depiction that the Mandellian is absolutely something totally different than the Shroud. So could you give me 2 reasons, the most powerful reasons, why this depiction of the Mandellian of Edessa indicates that it could not possibly be the Shroud?
The image is too small.
Give me 5, man. Okay. The second reason, what would that be?
It doesn't have a full body.
Exactly. Give me 5, lady. Okay. Now, both of you, please give me back the 5s. Because I have 3 reasons to contradict your suggestions. Three real reasons. The first reason is that this piece of cloth had two nicknames. And the first nickname was tetradiplon. Well, acheropitos was the first one, which means it wasn't made by human hands. But tetradiplon is interesting for us, and it means it was a fourfold. That's a historical fact. Now, on top of that historical fact, I want to propose a hypothesis. Okay? And we're going to do that just, first of all, imaginatively opening up the fourfold. Are you with me? So this is more or less the length of the cloth. Are you agreeing with that? Actually, it's a little bit too short, but we just take it like this. So let's open it up. One fold, two folds, three folds, four folds. So we have a long cloth. Now we could open it a different way. One fold, two folds, three folds, four folds. We still have a long cloth, relatively speaking. So it's not difficult to imagine that this cloth is big enough to put a whole body on it. Now we know for a fact that it was folded in four. Now let's imagine for a moment that they think that this image is of Jesus and they fold it up in four. Which part are they going to show the people? His shins or his face?
His face.
So if they have his face hanging at the main gate of Edessa for centuries, and Grandma comes out and she'll say, Johnny, look up, this is the face of Jesus. So the people are going to call it the face of Jesus, and that's how we have Mandellian. Okay? So we had a fact that is called fourfold, and a hypothesis that this could be a plausible explanation. Are you with me? Second fact, to contradict your intuitions. We know for a fact that this cloth was transferred on this very day, 15th of August, 1944, was celebrated in Constantinople at Hagia Sophia in the church. And here we have the emperor venerating the face like he should be, because this is the heart of the tradition of the Mandellian. But look at what we have here. You see the length of the cloth? That's the length of a man's body. And then you have all the cloth here. So what do we have here? We have a historical fact of a cloth representation that is at variance with the presentation here of the Mandellian, that it's only a face cloth. You follow? And that's a historical fact. This depiction is within a century of the transfer, so at some formal moment they're putting up this picture to remember those events. Okay? Now the third fact is, I have a homily from Gregorius Referendarius. Write down the name in case you need a name for a grandchild one day. And he said, this homily is so boring that Father Anthony and Father Capilla and Brother Zachary and all these people here, they couldn't give a homily that would be more boring. It's filled with bounce and bombast because they're so happy to have this cloth in Constantinople. And on the last page even I have a bit here in Greek from this homily. And inside this homily, Gregorius Referendarius, who was preaching at this very event, and this is a historical text, speaks about the face, which is to be expected, because this is the center of the Mandellian devotion, the face of Jesus. But he also speaks about the side wound with blood. So now I have a question for you, a critical question. If this cloth, the Mandellian, is not just a face but gets to have a side wound with blood, what's more reasonable? That it finishes at that level, or it goes down to include the feet? We can't prove it, but that's a valid supposition. We can't build on that, but what we can say at this point is the following: that the Mandellian of Edessa definitely cannot be excluded as a runner-up candidate or a possible candidate for being the Shroud. And we know for sure that the Mandellian was not just a head, it at least included a side wound, and that the cloth was probably very long. We do not have enough evidence to definitively prove that the Mandellian is the Shroud. So there's more work to do. Okay? Now let's move on to Budapest in Hungary, And here we have a double depiction on an old codex that's very important for Hungarians because it has the oldest historical evidence of Hungarian writing, Magyar language. And here there are two scenes. On the top, what do we see? The embalmment of the body. Here we have three men and a body. And down here, what do we have? Three men? Three women. And they're carrying jars of something. And then who's this?
The angel.
An angel. And where's the body? It's gone. And the art historians will even tell us, the art analysts, that here you have a representation of a cloth, besides other cloths as well. So this is interesting for the shroud studies because of 5 points that art specialists point out. Number one, he has a naked body. Actually, I didn't dwell on this point down here. It's a very unique feature of the Shroud of Turin that we have a Christ image that's presented in total nudity. If you look at the image we have there by Michelangelo of the Pietà, the private parts are covered, out of respect. If you go back earlier, you'd never find an image of Christ that shows you more than his face and his fingers like a Carmelite sister, a cloistered nun, because there's that respect. And here we find a very rude nudity, simplistic. So this is out of keeping with the standard mores of artistic representation of the Christ figure. The second feature we have are the number of fingers. How many fingers does he have?
4.
And you?
4 fingers.
So we have 4 fingers in each hand. The third feature is that the hands are crossed. And then if we go down to the second level, we find a representation of the cloth. And the zigzag lines, and just believe it for me now, and I'll show you the reason in the next presentation, they refer to the rare weave, the herringbone weave. And then the 1, 2, 3, 4 poker holes. Remember the second set of holes? They're called poker holes as a nickname in reference to a poker for fixing the logs in the fireplace. So here we have them. And the reason why that's important is that since we know the exact date of this codex and the fact, the end of the 12th century, and the fact that there was a Hungarian embassy in Constantinople because of a marriage between Habsburg and the House of Comnenus in Constantinople since 1150, there was a lot of traffic also from the Crusader period through Constantinople. Then this is evidence that these same poker holes that are on the Shroud of Turin precede a couple of hundred years the carbon-14 dating. However, since the carbon-14 dating no longer stands scientifically, this has lost its critical importance, let's say, but it's also an interesting little piece of historical evidence. This is a later piece that's interesting because it presents the man front and back, and it has the herringbone weave also represented, and it also has the coats of arms of the house of Vergé and the house of Charny, the two families that are connected with the shroud, the great-great-granddaughter of Otto de Roche and the family of Charny, whom she married into. And so in a certain sense that is a proof of connection between Otto de Roche's family and Charny, and it's done on the basis of the shroud image. So there's a very, very strong implication there. So here we have another chapter of intersection of history and culture and the shroud, potentially. Here we have a collection of representations of the Christ figure. And this Christ figure has its history. First of all, the artistic representations of Christ were a novelty, since images were not made in the Semitic understanding. So our first images of Christ appear in Rome. In the catacombs, there are images of Christ, the Good Shepherd, who is young, and he has a lamb on his shoulders, and these are in the catacombs, so the very early Christian gatherings, and the Roman culture was not alien to the idea of images. They had their images in the empire, so they represented Christ as the Good Shepherd. This image had obviously struck a great chord in their hearts. Then we go on to a second period when the Christ figure is presented as a young Byzantine emperor, and his fat and face is round. And there probably the idea is being communicated that we have this dominion, the Prince of Peace, this mighty ruler, filling the prophecies of Isaiah and so forth. And he's represented in this, let's say, Byzantine form, and the emperor had sufficient to eat, so he was well nourished. And these were just human expressions of the Christ figure that communicated for the people in their language and their understanding this majestic, this fullness of divinity, of power, of glory in Christ. And then a certain point is reached which sets the standard that really has remained till the present day. And we're looking at these kind of facial images, and they all belong to an artistic category called pantocrator. We know the word panto from the pantheon in Rome, all the gods, so it means all. And crater, the word in Greek, kratein, means to rule. And we have that in the word democracy, kratein, and we have it in those other words that use the same like aristocracy and so forth. So the pantocrator then is the figure of Christ, who is majestic. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He is the King of the living and the dead. He will judge the living and the dead at the last day. All authority has been given to him by his Father. And this is the figure that's represented in this art. And here a collection is made of ancient, outstanding pantocrator images. And we see them from the 4th century, and this one is actually in Rome. And we see them up to the 12th century, and this is right here in Jerusalem in the Holy Sepulchre, at the Calvary altar, the Latin altar, and the Latin part of Calvary. So the most famous classical one is in the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai in Egypt. And what we can say here is that there is a great uniformity of image. In general, in all of them, they have the same facial structure, distance between the eyes, forehead, the facial shape, and even smaller details like this little wisp of hair here, which later on becomes a standard in icons of Christ and seems then to be a hint to a feature on the shroud itself, which we have here. We have this tricklet of blood coming on the forehead, and maybe in their time they took this as a wisp of hair. I'm not sure what all the relationships are there. So basically then we have images in very different places, in Egypt, in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Greece, in the Ukraine. Here the big question arises, how come all these images have so much in common and they're in such different places and different times? And then the theory is that these images were inspired by the shroud image. So the shroud would have been the source of all these images. Now somebody could critically ask, well, couldn't it be then that somebody clever wanted to make the shroud image and decided, I'm going to gather all the other ones and find out what's common in them and make the shroud image? But then how did this commonality happen in all those different places at different times? And there's something also about the art of iconography. It's actually the person who does an icon writes it. And the goal is not to be innovative and creative. The goal is to be faithful to the original image. So then you have a fidelity copying of the original icon. And I wonder why that would be. Could that also be because of the will to be faithful to the image that they had discovered that was so mysterious on the shroud? And we do know that they had this image in Armenia, the Mandellian, which later is called the Sindone in Constantinople. And then the open question, as we already discussed downstairs, is the connection between this image, Mandellian, Sindone, is this the Shroud of Turin? So if this image, Mandellian, which was also called the Hieropitos, not made by human hand, therefore mysterious, if they understand that this is the Christ image, then they want to be faithful to the image that has been given mysteriously or miraculously to them. So this is a little bit the background here. There's a lot more work to do in this area. Just like many of the other fields, the Shroud continues to offer plenty of room for research. And Dr. Wolf, was the director of the Max Planck Art Institute in Florence, Italy, was here visiting one day, and we were discussing this and what comes first, the chicken or the egg, what comes first, the shroud or all these images. If all the images come first, then it still requires an explanation of how they ever came about, because they do have a commonality. Then if Dr. Wolf suggested that an interesting study would be to trace and document the dipping of the shroud or the possible shroud precursor names, the Mandellian and the Sindone in Constantinople, if that's the same piece of cloth, as that dipped under history and came up again to public awareness, if that matches these images, and we know for some of them definitely does. The most important image of all of these is actually not an icon. It's this coin. This coin of Michael III, Byzantine emperor, has a perfection and a completion that also matches this icon from St. Catherine's in a very wonderful way. And it's considered the most exact parallel to the image of the shroud itself. So here we have a beautiful close-up of the herringbone weave. You can see the V-shaped, it's called fishbone pattern in some languages. And here you can see it again. Now it's interesting that you can see this zigzag line here because the weave is obviously damaged. And actually you can also notice that from a different angle here, that the zigzag line almost communicates the reality of the herringbone weave. So you see a direct reference to the zigzag line that's in that piece of Hungarian codex, the Pre-Codex. Then another feature is, here you see the sisters, the Poor Clares in Chambéry, repairing and putting on the patches. And the patches are made actually from altar linens they used. But it doesn't have the herringbone weave, so you can see the contrast of the beautiful weave of the original cloth. When the medieval daters look at this, they say, wow, that's the proof that it could not be earlier, because this weave is so advanced technically, it would not be possible to have earlier than the medieval period. And this is where we have the Irish connection to the shroud. How many people here have a little bit of Irish in them? Oh, 13. Well, somebody here is 100% Irish. I'm sorry for his wife. So it's a historical fact that some herringbone weave was found in cloth in Hallein near Salzburg in Austria in the salt mines. And that's the home of the Celtic people. And we traded the entire Danube with the salt trade. And that's why Salzburg is called Salzburg. And the herringbone weave was dated 8 centuries before Christ. And we were there until Julius Caesar came and kicked butt and sent us up to the islands. So if you had herringbone weave on the Danube 800 years before Christ, trading all the way down this direction, then you cannot scientifically say that it was impossible to have it here 800 years later. You follow the reasoning? Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, of course, the textile experts know that Herod the Great had some pretty neat stuff in his closet. So it was possible to find nice quality cloth around here. Okay? Mm-hmm. We're finished with the historical part as such, and the hypothesis on history. And now we're going to move to a new section on natural science. And we're going to start out with a couple of commentaries across a little bridge that Pope John Paul II offers us when he visited Turin 13 years ago. He says, for the believer, what counts above all is that the shroud is a mirror of the gospel. Now, when you're combing your fringe in the morning, you don't comb your fringe in the mirror. You comb your fringe here, right?
No, I don't have much hair to comb.
And so the same thing is here. Our faith is not built on the shroud. That's just a mirror. The real thing is the proclamation of the gospel. That's where our faith in Christ is built. But the shroud provides a mirror-like effect that looking at this, we say, wow, we've got a lot of stuff here that's in the gospel. It kind of helps us into the contemplation of the gospel. Just like even the image we had down there of the Pietà on Good Friday in Calvary, it helps us to get into the mood and the spirit of the moment, right? So the shroud in this sense has a lot to tell us, a lot to point toward. And then it's like a mirror image of the gospel. Now, this means also that the church doesn't put the emphasis on the shroud that some people think. The church actually treats this shroud as a secondary object and is more concerned about maintaining the devotion around the shroud within its limits. The church is not the one to push and say the shroud is from Jesus, and the church doesn't do that. The church leaves that to science. The church normally does not say that the shroud is a relic. It would mean that the shroud touched the body of Jesus. The church talks about the shroud more in the category of an icon, which is precisely also what Pope Benedict did in Turin last May, and he talked about an icon in blood, which is very inspiring because there are actually blood stains, real blood, corresponding to most of the wounds of the Passion account that's in the Gospels. So he talks about an icon in blood. It's a very powerful image. Now, the second thing that John Paul II mentioned was that the shroud is a challenge to our intelligence, especially for the researcher, for his reason and his life. And this is where the shroud becomes really powerful. And this is why I love having agnostics and skeptics and deep frozen Catholics here to see it. We have many groups, also secular Jews come in to see it, and people of all kinds of doubts and other positions to where we stand on Christian faith terms, and they enjoy it and they relish this challenge to the intelligence. Here we have the first, let's say, natural science major discovery through photography. As you notice, as we're going through the shroud, you are finding that we are dealing with a lot of diverse chapters on the shroud. History, geography, art history, textiles, and so forth. And now we're into photography, and it's going to continue opening up new chapters. So you could think of a high school student writing a paper, and there even have been, what do you call these works, licentiate works or master's papers in the university written about the shroud. So what I just think of in a typical high school kid, it's a wonderful way, let's say in a public school, to do a report on photography, or a report on textiles, or a report on old cities or ancient pieces of art and so forth. And they can bring in this whole subject into a milieu that normally wouldn't be able to address this document. So here we have Secondo Pio, and I met actually a cousin nephew of his in New York at a talk I gave on the shroud. And 113 years ago, he took what is known as the first photograph of the shroud, which was a very hazardous undertaking because he had to set up a lot of lights, and it put the shroud in danger of catching fire because of the heat. So when he took this picture, he was absolutely astonished to discover that on the negative of his film, he was shocked to find that he had a positive of the man. Now I'll show you a couple of details so you'll understand this. You see this tricklet of blood we have here on the forehead? It's like a letter E. And over here is white, and it's like a number 3, and it's on the other eye. And the blood on the wrist here is on the other side over here, and actually the hands are inverted. See the fingers going this way? They're going this way here. And then we have this mark here, shows up on this side of the body over there. So what do we have here? We have a number of positive realities on the shroud, like blood traces, fold marks, burn marks, and they all show up as negatives on the negative, like they should. But the image of the man himself shows up like a positive on the negative film. So by the laws of physics, we have to accept, it imposes itself as a fact, that the original image behaves in the category of a photographic negative. We won't say it is a photographic negative because we don't know what it is. Science does not know the exact origin and process of the image development on the shroud. So it would be unfair to call it a photographic negative because it's not a photograph. It has some features of a photographic negative. How are we doing? Now, in interpretation then, some people come along and they say, well, you know, were able to do photography in the Middle Ages, and they had this chemical and that chemical and the other chemical, so why not? But how much proof can they give us? I want you standing up here. How much proof can they give us? So they say, well, you know, we have one example, the Shroud of Turin, and we have no literary evidence. So you can't call that a scientific theory, right? And then I'd ask you, you know, where have you seen Kodak or Fuji or Agfa put 14 feet of cloth, a negative image on 14 feet of cloth? So then I say, Leonardo, give me 5, man. You know, you put a negative on 14 feet of cloth. You know, this is quite something else, you know. Now the next photographer, Henri, 33 years later, these are his pictures, I think, and he has accomplished the most perfect photography of the Shroud that's recognized still today. Oh, by the way, regarding the negatives, science still recognizes the Shroud image in this category. This is still the scientific understanding of the image. So what Secondo Pio discovered 113 years ago is still considered valid today. Okay? Now, Henri's picture was so perfect that when they look at it with the microscope, they found photographs of pollen grains. He had a very long exposure. He had 257 grayscale, which means shades of white to gray, of white to black, and a long exposure to absorb a lot of information. So it's technically a very, very rich picture. And so they went to the Shroud and they started shaking out the pollen. And sure enough, there was pollen. And then a forensic specialist from Switzerland, Max Frey, starts sorting out the pollen. And guess what? He finds pollen from Jerusalem, from Edessa, from Constantinople, from Lire, from Chambéry, from Turin. From all of the cities that the traditional explanation of the Shroud Travels offers. Now, this particular study has entered a new critical phase because since Max Frey passed away and there's some problems with the legacy of the samples that he had, and there are also some new critical questions about the capacity of the analysis to show the specificity of the plants that narrow down, and the test would really have to be done again. But it opened up the enthusiasm of science to go after the Shroud, and that makes the Shroud today the most scientifically studied object there is. There's no other object that has been the subject of a barrage of scientific tests like the Shroud, with experts, top experts from all kinds of fields. And we'll see some of that now upstairs. So now we have come up to the second level of our museum, where we see a report by Professor Danin, who is a retired professor from Hebrew University. And Professor Danin is a very accomplished botanist. He has written, I think, 12 or more books in Hebrew and English, and also a latest one now on the botany of the Shroud. Professor Danin's name is on 40 different plant taxa, subspecies. So how many plants carry your name? You know, this means that he is no small dude in botany. And Professor Danin followed up on the Wangers. The Wangers are a couple of professors at Duke University, North Carolina, and they were the first to discover images of flowers on the Shroud. As we already commented, the Shroud boasts this extraordinary image, mysterious image of a man, front and back, naked, but also we've mentioned the images of coins that are reported, the images of a grass rope, the images of a spearhead, and even a reed and a sponge. I don't know too much about that. Well, Professor Danin was not actually enthusiastic about going after this study at all originally, but then when he learned that there were images of flowers which he knew very, very well from ancient times, this intrigued him. And he reports having identified images of hundreds of flowers, especially around the head of the man of the Shroud and really down to the waist, and some arranged in clusters, even bouquets. And many picked from the back, just cut off the stem and placed neatly in different places around the head. And Professor Danin decided then to analyze the different types of flowers and to group them. And he picked out 3 flowers which are abundantly represented on the shroud because of their geographical significance. And we start out with Gundelia tourneforti, and this grows in Turkey across right across to Mesopotamia. So taking in also part of present-day Israel and Jordan and all the way across Mesopotamia. And this is the only place in the world where Gundelia tourneforti grows naturally. Then he identified a second plant, Zygophyllum dumosum, and the flowers. And this grows only in the Sinai, in Negev, and into Jordan, and as far north as basically Jericho. So the third plant that he chooses is Cistus creticus, and this plant comes south as far as, let's say, the central Israel area, the West Bank, Jerusalem area. So Professor Dineen then tries to find the space where these 3 flowers intersect naturally on the planet Earth. And the only place that he can find where that happens is the space between Jerusalem and Hebron. Aha. Well, his conclusion then is, if we have images from flowers that can only be found there, then these images, along with the other images, were formed in a process with fresh flowers from an area between Jerusalem and Hebron. So the whole imaging process happened between Jerusalem and Hebron. And if that's the case, then the imaging of the men also happened between Jerusalem and Hebron. Of course, I say, Professor Dineen, you're wrong. My friend Leonardo was very smart. And he FedExed the plants on time over from here to Italy to his studios. And I have archaeological proof for that, because we have sketches of helicopters by Leonardo. Now, Dineen actually is using this argument in some of his talks internationally, and he says that he obviously has to change the story to be original. So he says that Leonardo invented the Learjet to do this and then destroyed everything so nobody would have any idea how he got the flowers over on time. But Dineen doesn't have any archaeological evidence for this because there are no diagrams of Learjets by Leonardo. Now, the second point that Dineen makes is that these 3 plants, plus 5 others, so we're talking about 8 plants, have presence on the shroud in flower form and a common blooming time in the calendar exclusively in March and April. Ha ha ha. What happens here in March and April? Yes, Passover. And some historians who analyze the accounts of the Passion and Christian history say that Jesus was crucified on the 7th of April. I think it's a different a couple of days off in the Julian calendar then. But we're in that period, March and April. Interesting, isn't it? Then there's another detail. I'm not sure if we have time for this on this CD, but another flower that Dineen finds on the shroud is the caper. The caper, maybe you remember eating with baked salmon. It's a little bitter, small little rolled up little bud. And the flower form of the caper, actually the caper grows very abundantly here, and even on the western wall there are capers growing. And down by the Dead Sea, a lot of them in that direction. So the capers on the shroud have a very interesting little story to tell. The botanists know when you look at a caper at the time of the day you look at it, you know the time of the day without looking at your watch. Because the caper opens in a certain way in the morning and is continuing opening through the day, and then it closes. And so Dineen, who is, I would say he's a regular secular Jew, here professor, scientist, and he says that the capers that he finds on the shroud seem to have been plucked around 3 p.m. And there's one other detail about the flowers that Dineen mentions, and this happened actually in a common reflection together with Dr. Sohns, who developed the hologram study. And the hologram study showed that a lot of the hologram information from the body is missing. And that is due to the fire that we explained about in Chambéry that burned the forearms. And there are also lots of holes. I mean missing information. So these two men got together, Dr. Soons and Dr. Danin, and it occurred to them maybe there's a relationship between the holes and the presence of the flowers. And sure enough, the holes match the presence of the flowers. So a conclusion could be drawn that maybe the flowers impeded the transmission of information from the body to the cloth. And so the flowers blocked that, and that part of the image information didn't reach the cloth. There's more to study, obviously, in all of that. Okay. Maybe some of you are asking how come there are flowers on the shroud, and was that common back then? And there are obviously areas that still need to be studied and gaps in information. There are hypotheses and different reflections. But let's just reflect like the following. The shroud is clearly a man, it represents a man who was crucified and scourged and crowned with thorns, horribly tortured. Therefore, a persona non grata for the society that treated him so, a person that would be rejected and thrown out. And probably most people who would have been crucified were left for the birds and the animals. There was not great love shown to them. And yet the man of the shroud, if we consider in conjunction with the information we have about the wounded man of the shroud, we put together now this information of a man that's surrounded by flowers. Then we have an indicator of the presence of a circle of people, an intimate circle of people that are close to him, that have a reverence for him, a loving memory of him, and want to show a respect, let's say in atonement, in reparation, in trying to compensate for the horrible injustices inflicted. So this also is a parallel to the type of figure we have in the gospel, a person who is completely ostracized by one part of the population and by certain powers that be, and on the other hand, a person who has a very deeply loving following that's very loyal and faithful. So we saw how the shroud is 4.5 meters long, or 14 feet long, and about 4 feet wide, or 1 meter. Now we have another cloth, a different cloth. This is called the Sudarium in Oviedo. Sudarium, the face cloth. This is its traditional name. And it's in Oviedo in the city of Spain since the year 711, which makes it exactly a round number of 13 centuries this year. This cloth also has a prehistory in southern Spain, central and southern Spain, Toledo, Cartagena, North Africa, Alexandria, and even originating here. It's an absolutely solid history for 1,300 years, and the earlier part now really is a tradition. We don't have the solid documentation except for the botanical evidence of botany that the cloth was in North Africa. So this cloth has a very established history, much longer, 7 centuries longer than the shroud in Europe, coming in the southern flank of the Mediterranean, whereas the shroud came on the northern, eastern and northern route according to the postulates. The forensic science gets very interested in this cloth. This cloth does not have any images, but it does have blood stains and also edema fluid stains from asphyxiated lungs, just like the shroud has at the mouth and at the side wound. This cloth has the same type of blood group, AB, as the shroud. So the forensic people really go to town on this and start studying all the wound forms. And they can show you how this part here covered the nose of a very battered, brutally tortured man, and that this part here is mirrored over here. And you have 2 lighter stains here that correspond, so, and with this little bridge here. They explain that the cloth, the Sudarium, was folded down the middle when this blood stain was fresh. And so that gave the double effect. They say they have sufficient information on this cloth that can provide about 120 points of congruence, of similarity to the image of the head of the man of the shroud. 3 times more evidence than they would need in some courts for a criminal conviction. We know then, according to the forensic conclusion, that this cloth belongs to the man of the shroud. It tells us that the forensic people tell us that this was on the man's face when he was in a vertical position. The man of the shroud is a crucified man. When is a crucified man in a vertical position? When he's on the cross. When did they put the cloth on his face? When he dies. Just like we do today with accident victims on the freeways, we put a cloth over their body, over their face especially. The spirit has gone in respect for the body and for that person. Eventually they have permission in the case that the crucified man then is taken down from the position of crucifixion and prepared for burial, because the man of the shroud seems to be a crucified man who was buried. And if this happens in a Semitic context, then we're talking about somebody that's going to be buried with care. But he's, according to the gospel story, if he matches the gospel man, then it's done in a hurry and not completely, with the plan to do more subsequently after the Shabbat, the Great Shabbat. So then they'll take off the cloth and clean the body. Now they can't put the cloth back on the body because it's already soiled, it has blood, human blood. Now they can't throw away the cloth because it has human blood. It has to go in the tomb. Now let's go into the tomb on Easter Sunday morning with Peter and John in chapter 20. And Peter goes in first, and then John subsequently goes in. And he notices the clothes plopped. That's the Greek verb that's used in the gospel. Like just blopped. And the face cloth folded up apart. When I was studying theology and exegetics of the Gospel of John, some people claimed that there was a cloth needed to tie the jaw for the rigor mortis development and so forth. And this one also seems to be a plausible explanation. This is a controversial study, but it has objective features. Father Philos in Chicago, a Jesuit, was the first one in the 50s to come up with the thought, with the observation that he had found coins on the shroud, imaged. And then he had a further development of this 30 or so years later. And there are people who dispute against this, but there are some very interesting things. First of all, let's go to what the claim is, that there are two coins imaged on the shroud in the area of the eyes, and one is called a leptum semplum and the other called a dilepton litus. And these two coins were both minted by Pontius Pilate. One was minted in the year 29 and the other between 29 and 32. So there was a problem with this coin here that has Tiberius Caesarus written on it in Greek. Now the problem is that there's a misspelling, and the Caesarus is spelt with a C. But it should have been written with a K, a kappa, because we're in the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine period, the Byzantine part, the eastern part, a Greek culture dominated, whereas Latin dominated in the west. But from Greece over this direction, Greek was the language. So then all the official documents were in Greek. And obviously the coins, being official state documents, were also in Greek. But you have a mistake. So they found that there was a C instead of a K. And they said, that's very weird. This shouldn't be. So they started looking for coins. And they found the first coin, and guess what? It had a C. And the second coin had a C. And the third coin? The whole series was done with a mistake, which is most human. So it turned out the mistake was also a real motivation for a tendency of credibility to this coin and this discovery. Then there were folks who came along and said, well, you can't have this kind of detailed information recorded on the fibers. They are too coarse, too thick. But now with the hologram study of the shroud image, we know that the image is not retained on the fibers, but on the fibrils, tiny microparticles of fibers. So that allows again for a new study of the possibility that this minute information could be held. So in summary, what we have here is a study based on the shroud, and from that shroud study we have an objective enrichment of numismatic science. So there has to be something to it. There's major opposition from some anthropologists who say we just don't find coins sufficiently in cadavers here, in skeletons, And I know personally one anthropologist who's an expert in this field. He's an atheist man, he's a Jewish man, Josias, and he says that he has found coins in 19 skulls. Now, some of those could also have arrived in the skull through that Greek mythological practice of paying the man to get the person across the Styx, you know. Now, here again, we can't go much further than this. So we're left with room for more study and investigation and speculation. It could just have been a very practical need. When I was a child, I saw neighbors, a neighboring lady, one of the first people I remember having died, with coins on her eyes to keep them closed until the rigor mortis set in a hurry to bury this man of the shroud. Maybe somebody looked for something to keep his eyes down. Who knows? Now, another little feature of this that I do, it's a little bit subjective, and I normally don't do this in the shroud as a whole, but this is the only time that I will ever say if the shroud is truly from Jesus. And I want to point out the coins. The coins are rather interesting. This coin, the Dilepton litus, what's the sign that characterizes it? What's that?
Shepherd's crook.
Shepherd's staff. And here what do we have? We have this symbolum, which was an instrument used in ritual of divination when they quartered birds and they poured wine with the symbolum over the birds before they ascertained the meaning of what they found for divining the future. So this is where this comes from. And they use this image then on the coin as the feature of that coin. So what do we have here? Well, we have a pastoral theme, the shepherd's crook, and we have a pagan religious theme of divination. And I was wondering, and this is just completely subjective, and I never considered the shroud in this presentation except for this particular moment as being for real, right? So if the shroud is for real, and it does wrap the body of Christ, according to our Christian faith, we say here is the ultimate offering that was offered, the ultimate sacrifice for the reconciliation of mankind with God. And here we have these symbols of half blind, half lame, limping along pagans, trying to make connection with the divine in their own haphazard, helpless way. And he doesn't mind associating these images of the poor little human efforts in turning our water into wine and taking it up with him in his offering. And I find that a very tender manifestation of his goodness to us. When you read across the spectrum of publications, and I don't claim to be an expert on that, but I have seen a number of different pieces and heard different opinions, there seems to be almost always invariably a voice or two or more who want to dismount the impressions that are put forward from certain investigations and studies. And I would almost say that almost all of the pieces seem to be questioned by one or somebody or other. So then you could say that it's all very wobbly, very, that it's open to critique. And really every field of science is open to critique. If you take this law of gravity, well, that was critiqued later by the law of relativity. So as scientific study advances, we find new light to understand the physical reality in a more nuanced and more complete way. And I would say that the shroud, being the most studied scientific object that exists in history, that's quite a claim. It is the most scientifically studied object, hard study. Then, therefore, the conclusions about the shroud are subject to revision and to critique and to correction. So that's also a fact. And for example, I'll give you one example. If we just remember what we already explained downstairs about the photographic negative, there we have an impression that we have a photographic negative from the science of photography 112, 114 years ago. Now, if we then realize with the hologram studies, and even prior to that, the NASA studies with the V8 analyzer some 30, maybe 35 years ago in Colorado Springs, then we realize that we have more than a photograph. So now we would have to say then that it's not really a photographic negative because it's not a photograph. We don't know what it is. So then it does have properties of photography, of the photographic negative, but you can't just say it's a photograph. It's more than a photograph. It's different than a photograph. It's richer than a photograph. It has more inside it than a photograph can carry. And so this, I think, then allows a certain liberty to realize that any of the scientific areas of the Shroud is really open to further enlightenment, further investigation and clarification down the road. That being said, I would also invite people to think about another subject. Even if each of the scientific areas that are proposed pretty seriously, like Professor Dineen's study on the flowers, like the numismatic study on the coins, which objectively enriched numismatic science, like the art history study, or any of the studies, even if they are subject to a certain critique and the possibility of ongoing nuancing and correction, isn't it amazing, and this is my point, isn't it amazing that the Shroud has so many riches for so many sciences to study? That photography has a field day, that holography has a field day, that botany has a field day, that art history has a field day, that textile studies have an extraordinary opportunity, that numismatic science can get involved, that basically all the fields, as new scientific tools emerge, many of them get an opportunity to discover something in the Shroud. So then this raises the question, what kind of a beast is the Shroud? Where did this thing come from? This is absolutely a mystery. I mean, how could you pack in so many things that medical science has discovered, that forensic science has discovered, that, like you think of the blood, the post-mortem blood. You think of edema fluid from asphyxiated lungs. You think of connections then to a cloth in Spain, 700 years in Europe before the Shroud came to Europe. And you say, how come we have this intersection of so many different themes and angles and manners of study? So really the Shroud in this sense is mesmerizing, and that very richness of mysteries about it, even if each one of them is subject to further critique and further study and even opposition, is in itself an incredible statement about the Shroud. So here we have two classical type of scourges or whips from the Roman period, and there are two types. Each whip has 3 thongs of leather, at the end of which in one case are pieces of bone from pigs, and the other one has a double lead ball, and there are 3 sets. Now a study has been done with those double lead balls for our museum, and you can see this referred here, where the balls match the double wounds, and this allowed for a counting of the wounds and for establishing the position where the man stood when he was scourging, and also that some strokes were done backhand. It's amazing that they can recapture this detail. Then they were able to count the wounds, and some of the scholars claim that there are 117 clearly recognizable wounds. Now, if you do this with whip blows, each delivering 3 wounds, then we need to divide 117 by 3, and what number do we get? 40 minus 1. 3 40s are 120. 117, 40 minus 1. And St. Paul says that he was scourged 5 times, and each time 40 minus 1. Now, obviously, the Romans would not have been held by the norms of Deuteronomy for whipping, and nevertheless, this seems to be a fact on the Shroud. Now, this varies significantly with the representation of the scourging in Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ. And there, it's clear he did not follow the scientific studies from the Shroud of Turin, but followed the mystical sources that he also relied on for some of his production. So here we see nails, and these are not done from imagination. These nails are based on a historical discovery. This is the heel of a crucified man which was discovered here in Jerusalem some decades ago, and actually today there is a replica of this discovery in the Israeli Museum here in Jerusalem. And these nails were made accordingly. There was one study done on this discovery which had an error and was subsequently corrected. And the nails that we have were designed based on the uncorrected study. Now this is a replica of the measurements that the Israeli Museum provided for me. It's made of olive wood. It is the same thickness as these nails which are here, just about half the length. And obviously at that time the Romans didn't have federal prescriptions of how nails needed to be made. They were practical, and they made the nails as they needed them. And the nail in the heel of this man is this long, and that they could have longer nails is also absolutely possible. So when these nails go through the hand, one thing the Romans knew to do was to crucify, sadly, and effectively, because they wanted to suppress peoples through crucifixion. Crucifixion needed to be public and painful and enduring. So they knew that when they put a nail in here that they wanted to avoid the arteries, because if they cut the artery, the man would die in 15 minutes. He would bleed to death. And they wanted them screaming for 3 days, 4 days. So they knew how to crucify. And they would put the nail in at an angle, not through the palm, but a little bit deeper down, to catch these bones here. And then by putting this in here, a doctor in France called Dr. Pierre Barbet, a surgeon, wrote a book called A Doctor on Calvary, based on just the data from the Gospels and then on Shroud information, and particularly based on his own experimental knowledge dealing with accident victims from factories and work, and dealing with experiments with cadavers. And he showed that by putting the nail in here in a certain way, you cut the median nerve. And this leads to a paralysis of the thumbs, which is very painful. And now I want you to count how many fingers you can see here. And you see 4 on each hand, and they're crossed like this. So this connects with the piece of art we study downstairs in the Prey Codex from Budapest. So you have the 4 fingers on each hand, the hands are crossed. You have the herringbone weave, and you have the poker holes, and you have the nude body. So we have these 5 points: the 4 fingers, the hands are crossed, the nude body, the poker holes, and the herringbone weave cloth. And these 5 points are documented in that piece of Hungarian art, and so you can see how the art historians make a connection to the Shroud, which clearly has a less naive presentation, a real presentation of these 5 pieces, whereas the piece of Hungarian art is a little naive, let's say, but nevertheless very dependent historically then on the Shroud by just the laws of probability. So this is how then the different fields cross over and help each other. And here we can see also how a high school kid can have a field day in any area of study. You could take art history, you could take medical studies, forensic studies, you could take photography, you could take holography, you could take botany, and a high school kid could do an essay on any one of these subjects based on the Shroud and bring in a provocative subject to his classroom and create some waves. What do you notice different about this crown of thorns? What strikes you as being different? Most of the crowns that we see in works of art are thorn crowns, or even the ones you can buy here down near the Via Dolorosa or near the Holy Sepulchre that people have on sale, are little strip crowns, little circular strip above the ears placed on the head. And that follows the pattern of understanding of European style crowning, because most of this art representation comes from European artists. Now, Professor Dineen in his studies of the shroud and images, botanical images on the shroud, also has identified the thorns. And we have two major types of thorns here of plants. We have this one that actually has, with a little hook, it really has two types of thorns, the short ones, and they grow a lot here around Jerusalem. You need to be careful when you're hiking sometimes in rougher areas. And then you have the longer one, Spina sisyphus Christi. That's the name of the plant. And Professor Danine says that this plant has a very unusual quality. It's the hardest wood in the area. And because it was so coveted for making tools, for example, the knife of the plow, the coulter of the plow to cut the sod. In the plow you have the coulter that cuts it, and then the shear that turns the sod. So that this wood was used for that purpose. That meant it was a very resistant wood, a very tough wood. So Professor Danine says something very, very horrible. If you're very sensitive, you might want to plug your ears. That these long thorns formed into a crown like this and beaten on a man's head, they would not bend or break. They would penetrate and perforate. And I realize that we are reaching now a moment of the museum that's getting very harsh. And the purpose of the museum with the nails and the display of the whips and so forth is not really to have a horror movie effect. That's not our purpose. And I'd just like to have a little commercial about the purpose. I used to hear confessions in the Twin Towers in Manhattan for a number of years before they fell on September 11th. And there are many people alive. I knew a lot of people who passed away and also who escaped. And there are people alive today who will tell you, I'm alive because that fireman or that policewoman died for me. And we can think there on September the 11th how they rushed into the buildings, rescue personnel. They didn't rush into those buildings for a horror movie effect. They went in to save lives. They went in out of love. Now, it's the exact same language that St. Paul uses, and he says that Jesus died for me. Then, in the second place, St. John's Gospel opens the Passion account in chapter 13 with the following line. When Jesus knew that the time had come for him to go to the Father, he loved his own who were in the world, and he loved them to the extreme, to the end. And these pieces help the pilgrim to appreciate what this extreme is. These are not here because of imagination. These correspond to the historical account of the Passion of our Lord in the Gospels. They also correspond to the scientific study of the shroud and historical knowledge, as for example in the case of these whips. These are classical Roman whips, or the nails, which are also based on an archaeological discovery here in Jerusalem a couple of decades ago. So then the pieces here of the Passion build a type of mirror image of the Gospel, which is exactly what Pope John Paul II said. The shroud functions like a mirror image of the Gospel. And in this sense, then, it's such a privilege to come to Jerusalem and to be in these places of such historical significance. And when one goes to pray on the Via Dolorosa or goes to Golgotha, one is deeply impacted by the awareness of being here. We are here in Jerusalem. But when the pilgrims come after dinner, for example, in the evening time, come down and see these displays, then they realize not just that they are here, but they also realize more concretely how much was this extreme that Christ suffered. And this helps them to enter more deeply into the contemplation of the Passion, and then they are much more blessed through it. And for this reason, we are keeping the museum as a permanent exhibition for all the pilgrims here in Jerusalem, and also for people from all over the world who come here to visit, don't stay here at Notre Dame. Here we have a replica, a miniature of a classical tomb-like structure, where you would have an entry into the side of the hillside or the rock area, and then a doorway which would be sealed by a stone that's to be rolled. And this is where you have who will roll back the stone. Then you have a large space, and people can gather here. And Also, maybe some of the preparation can be done here. There's more room. And then there's a smaller niche with a stone on top of which the body is laid. This stone is not a box like a coffin. It is a platform on which the body is laid. And usually it was left there for a year, and then they would gather up the bones, which would be the only remaining part, and place them in an ossuary. And so we have the lines in scripture that he was laid to rest with his fathers. And usually that's really referred to the collection of the bones and laying them in the ossuary with the ancestors. So this helps us to understand also the structure of Jesus' tomb. Now, we have some interesting passages here actually we see the representation of how the body is laid. And here also a suggestion of how a cloth might be laid in this particular case. Because if we follow the account of Lazarus' resurrection, we have more binding around the body, and he has to be unbound. And if the shroud image does correspond to Jesus and his tomb, then obviously the cloth had to be placed underneath and above the body in a way similar to as depicted here. I would like to draw attention to the fact that in the Gospels we have these words, in Matthew, that Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb. And then we have the mention of the myrrh and the aloes, and here in John's Gospel, the linen cloths with the spices. Now, I would like to go to John's Gospel for the resurrection account. They both ran, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Who is the other disciple? Well, the tradition says it's John. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying and the napkin, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in and saw and believed. So this last line is very important. The other disciple, John, who reached the tomb first, also went in and saw and believed. I suggest that in this line we have a documentation, a description of the arrival to the gift of faith in the risen Lord that's described in that detail for the first time ever. And I would like that we dwell on this and try to understand it a little more, what happened. They both ran to the tomb, and John runs faster than Peter, but he waits for Peter to go in. I have a question for you. Why did he wait for Peter to go in? Some people here have suggested he was afraid. Other people have thought it's because of Jesus' distinction to Peter and the primacy that he gave him. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So John respects this role Peter has and waits for him and allows him to be the first one, the official representative of the community, to be the first one to enter and examine the discovery of the empty tomb. And this is step one. And in the second step, John himself goes in and he sees the cloths, the linen cloth, the cloths lying, and the napkin, which is not lying with the linen but rolled up in a place by itself. Now, I have a question for you. Who was the last person to go in here, to be inside here with the body on Good Friday evening? Who do you think? What would you say? People suggest different things. Some people have said Nicodemus. Some people say Joseph of Arimathea, it's his tomb. Some people said, Jesus. Well, I say Jesus wasn't there, just his body was left there. Who was the last person in here on Good Friday evening? And somebody said maybe John. And why would that make sense? Well, actually, the last person would be Mary, the mother. If we notice in most human situations of grieving and bereavement, the last people that are close to the coffin before we close it or at the gravesite are the close next of kin. So let's say it would be Mary. But we know from the Gospel account that John is close to Mary. Maybe it wasn't that he was that brave. Maybe it was simply that Mary tugged his sleeve and said, I need you. Just stick with me. Maybe she just had to look into his eyes and hadn't to say a single word. But we see that John is with Mary at the cross. And he's there at the burial. And all of the other disciples are gone. Peter is not there. So now we have a situation where the burial process is almost finished. And Mary is paying her last respects on Good Friday evening, late afternoon. And John has to be paying attention like anybody does to close relatives, somebody who's helping them in these very difficult moments, that everything is okay, that she doesn't trip, that she doesn't hit her head off the stone. So maybe he's the last one inside. Well, I'm just dramatizing this a little bit. I don't want to over-insist that he was the last person. It's not necessary for that. But one thing is sure, that there's a big difference between John's experience and Peter's experience on Easter Sunday morning. Because Peter has no point of comparison to what he had seen on Friday evening. He wasn't there. Whereas John had been inside the tomb. And now John is able, on Sunday morning, when he looks in, his mind is jumping immediately. That's exactly the way we left that cloth. The head cloth, the face cloth, which may be then connected to the Sudarium of Oviedo. So then he has a visual that's making him reflect, a point of concrete contrast and comparison. And besides that, in his heart, he has an attitude of humility because he allowed Peter to go in first. He could have rushed in. He could have gone in on his ego trip to be the first one there. But he followed the cue of Jesus. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So he has an exercise of faith that develops in an obedience and follows Jesus' cue about the respect for Peter. And he's already exercising the faith. Now, seeing the cloths doesn't give him faith. Faith is a grace. It's a grace gift. But on the other hand, when we see somebody praying devoutly, aren't we moved? Isn't our heart more disposed to say, wow, I'd like to pray like that person is praying so intensely? Or when we come here to Jerusalem, we see the Mount of Olives, we see the Sea of Galilee, and we say, wow, it's real. Those experiences don't give us the faith. Faith is a grace. But still, those experiences help us humanly to open our hearts, to not resist, to let the grace be given, to receive the grace. So here we see John describing two aspects of what happens to him. He sees details that he can contrast with from Friday evening to Sunday morning that make sense. Nobody robbed this grave. This thing has just happened really mysteriously. And he has exercised an act of humility and faith. So he is in the best dispositions for the grace of receiving that gift of being one of the first believers in the risen Christ, in the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So now we reach a climax moment of the presentation on the Shroud of Turin, the man of the Shroud. Who is the man of the Shroud? And the question we have to deal with is, how did this image get on the cloth? How did the information that's from the body get transferred to the cloth? And the issue is not easy to solve. There have been different theories. One theory was that it's painted. Now, if I paint your shirt, your jacket, the paint is going to penetrate the fabric. So it's going to have a certain depth level in the fabric. But in the case of the image of the Shroud of Turin, there's no depth. It's not even a micron deep. And you would need about 20 human hairs piled up on each other to get a micron. So scientifically speaking, it's impossible that it was painted. There are also other technical reasons. You can only read the image about 20 feet away, the real image in Turin. So the painter would have to be 15 feet, 20 feet away to do his work, if he did it. It's not painting. Let's leave it like that for now. Second possibility, you will remember that at the beginning we spoke of the common acceptance and conviction that there must have been a real body with the same wounds to produce the image. So how could the image have been formed? Well, the body touched the cloth. If I step on a white cloth, a sheet, or even a piece of white paper, I will leave my footprint. Now, that could be a possibility. Maybe this body that was dirty, bloody a little bit, even though it was partially cleaned, maybe oily, left its stain. Now, if that's the case, then it has to have the qualities we have discovered over here with the NASA science instruments, the V8 analyzer, Jackson and Jumper, who did this study over 30 years ago. And they see this incredible depth in the image. They use the instruments for the lunar landing studies to calculate depth so they could understand how they would have to adjust their equipment. And somebody had the bright idea to say, well, could we check out the Shroud image to see if it has this kind of information? And guess what? It did. So we have this extraordinary richness of 3D depth, not only of the face, of the entire body. So if we touch the body to the cloth, now we need to make sure that this technique is going to give us all that detailed depth information. So let's do a little experiment. We call this Notre Dame number 1. So anybody have a scarf? Now I'd like to have a tall troublemaker here so everybody can see well. Do we have a tall troublemaker here? What about you, Stuart? And we'll do a little experiment here to see if this process could have happened in this particular way. It's a beautiful scarf. So Stuart, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up the image of your face on the cloth in a similar way that we suppose it would have happened with the contact of the body and the shroud. So if you turn at an angle so everybody can see you here well, and we'll put this up here like this, and if your wife is in agreement, Margie, if you're in agreement, what I will do is I'll take away your hands, please. Let me take down your hands. I will take everything from your face, all the details, all the creases, all the warts and all, like Churchill said, and then I will punish him, and you tell me how much, Margie, for his misdeeds today. And now we have the distance of Stuart's ears from each other, right? And they're actually a little bit oversized. What do you think? Why are Stuart's ears so much further apart than mine? He has like a buffalo size. How do you explain this? Well, because it went wrapped around your face, because we have to get all the information from all around your face like we have on this 3D images. So now we have, this is the measurement of your ears. And let's compare this to the man of the shroud. This is the distance of the ears. So what's the conclusion? It's impossible that it was done by physical contact. In fact, there's a great anthropologist here in Jerusalem. He's an atheist, and I won't say his name now because I love the man and he likes the museum, even though he wants the shroud to be medieval. Thank you. And his jaw dropped when he realized, just with this simple experiment, that it was impossible for the image to have been formed by physical contact with the shroud. And it's interesting for me to reflect, this is a little side comment. You will see many documentaries on the shroud with different experts speaking. I'm not an expert. I'm just telling you the stories I've picked up about the shroud and the knowledge from experts who passed through here and had critical questions and caused me to think, and I've learned a lot. But these experts authoritatively speak to certain aspects, let's say botany. But sometimes then, because they've obviously read beyond their own field, they make statements that they have picked up from some publication which are actually not critically tested. And here was a man who has extraordinary anthropological knowledge and presumed that the image had been made by physical contact with the cloth and had never critically tested that. And by just doing this little experiment, Notre Dame 1 here, his jaw dropped and he realized that he had to revisit his understanding of how the image had been formed. Now, another consequence of this little test is, not really of the test, but we know that there is 3D depth image of the body in the cloth, in the image on the cloth. So how did that happen? How did that come about? And actually there is no scientific explanation. And you will find certain videos produced by certain groups that claim to explain it scientifically. And actually, if you look more closely, you'll realize that it's not a scientific explanation. They will say, well, he rose from the dead. But you can't go there with science. This is a data of faith, and you cannot repeat the experiment. You cannot measure it with any of the natural science tools. So it's inaccessible to natural science study. On the other hand, since science has no answer, it is fair for somebody to say, well, I know what happened. He rose from the dead, and there was light, there was energy, and it sent all this information. Well, okay. You can say this, but you're not using scientific information. And then some of these presentations then combine this intuition based on faith with scientific principles like we have in black hole physics, where you have a disappearing body with high energy presence that technically, theoretically could leave an image. And with a good dose of imagination, they give you an explanation which seems plausible. It could even seem convincing, and it's nice, and it fits in many aspects, but you can't claim it's scientific because it's not. So science does not have an explanation. We have a fact that the information of the face has been relayed to the cloth. Not just the face, the whole body, not just the front, the back. So the whole body, front and back, has left its information on the cloth. Now we have an experiment 2. Notre Dame 2 experiment. Can you see the shadow my shoe is making on the ground? Now you see the distance, you see the shadow that my hand is making. And can you see the difference, even on the camera? Which one is stronger? Which shadow is stronger? Why? Because it's closer. So the shadow of the shoe is stronger because it's closer to the ground. So let's do this other little experiment. Let's say this is the cloth, or let's get a piece of paper. And I want to project my face onto the cloth. So this is the distance of my nose to the cloth. The distance of my eye. The distance of my ear. So there's a difference of distance of the different body parts to the cloth that's receiving the image. And therefore, at least there's space for us to understand that there might be a possibility of some depth recording through a process that would have delivered this information from the face to the cloth. It was not done by painting, it was not done by physical contact, it was not done by solar effect. It's mysterious. There's no satisfactory explanation. But what we can say is that there was a process of information transmission, and then maybe in that transmission, this depth difference was able to record the 3D that we have. Now, what I can show you is a consequence of this. We need to look at the 2 hologram panels, which were very expensive, cost over €100,000. They are the first edition. Now there are 4 copies in the world, in Brazil, Sacramento, Rome, and here, and some others are being planned. And let's look at them, and you can see the richness of the image. On these panels, you recognize on the left panel the front of the body, and on the right panel the back of the body. And as you look closely, you realize that you have a 3D image. So if you jog your head slightly right and left, it helps your eyes to pick up the depth of the body and the distance between the body and the cloth. And these are extraordinary images that have been gleaned by laser reading of the INRI photographs of 1931, which are still considered today to be the very best photographs ever made of the Shroud in that type of technology, and very rich in information of the image. So a laser reading of these photographs prepared the material that was fed into a computer image generation process to produce these images. These are a kind of hologram image. This type of imagery was developed in the last century. A Hungarian scientist won a Nobel Prize. Then there was a second Nobel Prize for its technological application, and today it's even used in jeweler shops. So you can have a gold watch in front of your eyes, and you put your hand in, and there's nothing there. It's just a light image. Now, the amazing thing here is that we have an image that we know showed up in Europe for the first time in the 14th century, and probably has a lot of prehistory, and it has this type of quality. The Dutch scientists who did the process of producing this image claimed that you would need you would need an atomic laser to produce this kind of image on cloth. And today, with all the equipment that's out there, technologically and scientifically, nobody is still capable of reproducing the image or something close to it that we have in Turin. So at this point, I say, Leonardo, give me 5. If you wanted to notice some other details, you can see that the man's body is completely naked. You can also see the hair at the back of his head is coming down together. You can see that all the muscles are full rounded, especially the buttocks, but all of the muscles. And this would lead to a conclusion that in the moment of the image processing, that body was not lying on a hard surface that pressed those muscles. There is much more being discovered and opened up here. Also, a factor of studying the wounds as imaged on the cloth, referring from the body where the curvature of the body has affected the form of the image on the cloth. There's a whole new avenue here of study for the imagery of the shroud. Also, for example, the head wounds from the thorns confirm that the crown was a complete helmet around the head, covering it completely. So here we can see a new technology applied to the shroud through the intuition of some scholars, and discovering a whole new level of richness that nobody ever anticipated before. We could also say that this image as we have it here is still limited because the source of the image is the richness of the photograph made by Henry in 1931. Imagine the day when it would be possible to technologically capture the original image within the shroud itself, that some scientists have suggested may be in the category of a hologram itself, or maybe even beyond, because hologram is all we have today. It's the most advanced level of technology for studying this kind of image. So over 35 years ago, more or less, we know from the NASA scientists that we have 3D depth, and then we have the conclusion that there is a real body. So what would be the next step? Well, to reverse engineer the body. Luigi Mattei, a sculptor of great renown from Italy, produced this bronze of the man of the shroud in an effort to approximate as accurately as possible the form of the body as we have it in the Shroud of Turin. With a variable or two, he has not included all of the wounds. Maybe for aesthetic value that it's a little lighter. We can see the double wounds. You see the side wound, the double lead balls, the nail wounds, the knees are damaged. But in general, you can say that there's a blood trickle here represented. You can say that there are very few wounds compared to the evidence from the shroud itself. And this allows for other originals to be made, other editions in an original form with different wounds. And there are actually 4 copies of this, or 4 editions of this, original editions on display in California, Brazil, Rome, and here, and some others are being prepared as we speak. If we were to pronounce the less, let's say, scientific statement of the presentation, we could say the following. The image in Turin could not be explained unless there was a body like this for its production. After an hour of completely rational presentation, I have not asked anybody here to believe anything. We are just presenting the studies and the scientific findings regarding the Shroud of Turin and different hypotheses. If you allow me to have a subjective moment. How do you read his face? Is he angry? Is he filled with revenge? Is he frustrated and bitter? What do you say? Peaceful. Everybody says that. I have over 1,000 groups here, at least personally, that I have led through the museum, probably more over the last 4 years. And everybody agrees that this face is filled with peace. It's a peaceful countenance. Now, can you put on peace like a jacket, or does peace have to come out of your heart? It has to come out of your heart. So now allow me to draw another parallel with one little caveat. For mortuary work, we know that when a person dies in great pain, there can be very horrible facial expressions of tension, of fight with this pain. But once the person is released, once the person passes and the soul is gone, then there's no more fight. And the body can relax. The muscles can tend to the more normal position, a more peaceful, serene appearance. Now, we're in a subjective moment, so allow me to leave this aside and go to another point. If we have seen from the nails and the crown of thorns and the whips that we have a mirror image of the gospel account, would it be unfair to suggest if this face might not be a possible mirror image of the heart of him who said, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they are doing"? How can you forgive somebody if you are not at peace? How can you forgive somebody if you're still mad angry at them for what they have done to you? Even if it's a small thing, especially if it's a small thing, and then if it's a big thing. And here there's a lot to forgive. I am 37 years in religious life, and I've meditated much on Calvary. And I had never realized until doing this presentation here how much peace was in the heart of the man on Calvary. To be able to say, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they are doing." He goes on to say, "Today you will be with me in paradise." How can you think of paradise with the body in this condition and the soul completely rejected? Crucify him, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. And yet he's saying, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And I think of the football players and the rugby players. And they come back off the field with broken elbows, broken teeth, and they're not angry. They went out to win a trophy. And he went out for his trophy. And today you will be with me in paradise. He has his trophy. And there'll be millions more coming. There is great purpose in the suffering, great acceptance of it, great peace over it, through it. Then he goes on to say, "Mom, your son, son, your mother." How can you think of other people when you have a bad toothache? How much dominion do you need in suffering to think of other people? How much peace do we need to have inside of us to be able to consider the needs of others as we suffer? And I think of my own parents, God rest their souls, growing up on a rainy farm in the west of Ireland. In the wintertime, my parents sometimes had worse colds than we had, and they would nurse us and take care of us like they had nothing. Because a parent has that capacity of interior dominion and love to look after a sick child. "This is your son, mother. This is your son. Son, this is your mother." And then he goes on to say, Everything is fulfilled. And there are two fountains of peace there. Number one, I knew everything was coming. From the prophecies, the Psalms, and I accepted it. Just like I have to go to the dentist. I accept the suffering. I don't lose sleep over it. I have to get the tooth out, or I have to get an injection. But then it's all finished. The worst mission that was ever assigned in history is completely fulfilled to the last iota. What an incredible sense of peace when we fulfill a mission. What an incredible peace must have been in the heart of him on Calvary. And his final words, into your hands I commend my spirit. Fine comb these words and see if you find the slightest trace of complaint or rebellion, bitterness, and you cannot. Into your hands I commend my spirit. That's full of transcending the suffering. It's a gift of self beyond all of the injustice. No greater love and no greater peace.